On August 13th, from Ron Reed, 1996, an interesting story appeared in the San Diego Union Tribune. According to this report, former Drug Enforcement Agency agent Celerino Castillo stated that he and three other ex-narcotics agents were willing to testify before Representative Robert Torricelli's proposed subcommittee on the intelligence community and human rights violations in Guatemala and Central America regarding the extent of direct involvement by the Central Intelligence Agency in international drug trafficking. The estimate he gave the newspaper was that approximately 75% of the drugs that enter the United States do so with the acquiescence or direct participation of the United States and foreign Central Intelligence Agency agents, the Mossad, the British intelligence organizations, and several others. Several years ago, the Senate Subcommittee on Terrorism, Narcotics, and International Operations, which were headed by Senator John Kerry, held hearings on allegations that the Contra forces fielded by the United States in its war against Nicaragua were using national security as a cover for cocaine smuggling. Oliver North, who was one of the primary organizers of the terrorists, wrote in his diary that at least $14 million that went to his arms operations came from drugs. And you all love him. He almost got elected to the Senate in Virginia. In its final report, the subcommittee was able to establish, despite stonewalling by the Reagan administration and shortages of staff and time that caused it to cut short many intriguing leads, that involvement of the Contras in drug smuggling had been pervasive, with at least 4 of the humanitarian organizations set up to funnel tax money to the front being run by known drug traffickers. Other published reports in the mid-'80s indicated that the Afghani freedom fighters that the CIA armed and trained in its biggest operation of the post-Vietnam Cold War were responsible for between 40 and 80% of the heroin coming into the United States during those years. They would furnish the intelligence community with heroin, and the intelligence community would give them arms and Stinger anti-aircraft surface-to-air missiles. Nor is the involvement of the Central Intelligence Agency and its sister agencies in the international narcotics pipeline a recent phenomenon, ladies and gentlemen. In the 1950s, there was the Burmese and nationalist Chinese Golden Triangle, source of most of the world's opium, funneled across the Pacific Ocean to Central and South America, across land to fishing boats, to the offshore oil well platforms of Zapata Oil, and then into the United States, all headed up by George Herbert Walker Bush. In the 1960s, General Vang Pao and the Hmong growers, who served as the CIA's secret army in exchange for the agency's aid in transporting its opium to the West. And in the 1970s, the rogue operations of Theodore Shackley, Edwin Wilson, and the Australian Nugan Hand Bank, rogue only in the sense that the CIA maintained its deniability, and jettisoned the high-level officers in charge when their role threatened to become known. All this documented in my book, Behold a Pale Horse. And throughout, there were, of course, the experiments with LSD on U.S. citizens, along with other operations whose records were deliberately destroyed when Congress began investigating them after Watergate, but nevertheless enough survived so that we knew that this was conducted under an operation called MK Ultra, and that Dr. Timothy Leary was working for the Central Intelligence Agency and helped addict tens of thousands of our young people to LSD and other drugs. Indeed, the complicity of the United States and other intelligence communities in the drug trade, ladies and gentlemen, is so widespread that last year, Shapolsky Publishers titled an expose by former CIA agent Ken Bucci, quote, CIA, Cocaine in America, end quote. There are a number of other well-documented books that have traced these sordid facts Among the best, folks, are Alfred McCoy's classic entitled The Politics of Heroin, originally published in 1972 as The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia, and reissued in greatly revised and expanded format in 1991. The Great Heroin Coup, Drugs, Intelligence, and International Fascism by Danish journalist Heinrich Kruger, published in 1980. The Big White Lie, The CIA and the Cocaine Crack Epidemic by former top DEA agent Michael Levine, published in 1993. Cocaine, Politics, Drugs, Armies, and the CIA in Central America by Peter Dale Scott and Jonathan Marshall, published in 1991. The Crimes of Patriots, A True Tale of Dope, Dirty Money, and the CIA by former Wall Street Journal reporter Jonathan Whitney, published in 1987. In Banks We Trust by the late Penny Lernoux, published in 1984. Storming Heaven, LSD and the American Dream by Jay Stevens, published in 1987. The chapter titled Noises Off Stage, regarding CIA MK-Ultra experiments using LSD on unsuspecting American citizens in the 50s and 60s, and Acid Dreams, the CIA LSD in the 60s Rebellion by Martin Lee and Bruce Schlain, published in 1985. But you see, folks, despite overwhelming evidence of the direct involvement of agents of the state in pushing both heroin and cocaine, the official stance of the apparat is that it is diligently pursuing a, quote, zero tolerance, end quote, strategy aimed at eliminating the, quote, scourge of illegal drugs, end quote, from our society, and nothing could be further from the truth. The war on drugs is not a war on drugs at all, but is a war on the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. As the cliche has it, the first casualty in this war, ladies and gentlemen, has always been the truth. You see, we are now in the 24th year of the drug war, a war first declared by Richard Nixon during his re-election campaign and rededicated, as the Boston Globe noted, by every president within living memory. Has this war done anything? Has drug use gone down? Not at all. Not at all, ladies and gentlemen. The population has increased. Drug use has gone up with the increase in population and even above that. But as a result of this war, the United States prison population is larger than any other nation in this world per capita. Five out of every 8 federal prisoners are in for drug-related crimes, primarily personal possession of marijuana, referred to by a DEA administrative law judge as, quote, the safest therapeutically active substance known to mankind, end quote. And on the state level, it's 5 out of 6, ladies and gentlemen. Growing an acre of hemp or marijuana can net you the death penalty, while the crime bill presently before Congress would strip courts of their jurisdiction over prison conditions, declaring that routine brutality and stifling overcrowding are, by legislative fiat, neither cruel nor unusual, certainly not unusual, and certainly not today. Not unusual at all. Federal forfeiture laws have ensured the deepest levels of corruption of local law enforcement officials all across the country, as municipalities and counties, strapped for cash, have taken advantage of the provisions that allow the agencies to keep assets supposedly accumulated through drug profits without even having to go through the rigmarole of convincing a jury of guilt, without, in fact, having to even bring charges at all. Most of you don't realize it, that anybody can make an anonymous report to the local police department that you are a drug dealer. And before the sun dawns the next morning, you can all be lying naked on the floor, having been stripped, searched, of all your bodily orifices, in front of all of your family members, and having occurred to all of the family members, except the most minor children, holes punched in your walls, sofas and mattresses ripped to pieces, chairs cut apart, ceilings torn. One contractor told me, ladies and gentlemen, that a whole home, a house that has been searched by law enforcement for drugs, has to be condemned because it cannot be repaired or brought back to livable conditions. All this can be done and is being done across this country without a warrant. Without any kind of lawful probable cause. All property, bank accounts, cars, vacation cottages, clothing, RVs, trailers are seized and can be sold at auction without ever bringing any charges, without anyone ever having been brought to trial, are convicted, are pleading guilty, or anything. And they can never, and as far as I have been able to determine, have never been able to reclaim their property or be reimbursed properly for it. And all of this is unconstitutional, of course. Because the Constitution says that no property may be taken without just compensation. It doesn't make exceptions for anything whatsoever. It specifically says nothing can be taken without just compensation. Period. And it is supposed to be the supreme law of the land. Police forces, ladies and gentlemen, as I am speaking to you from Philadelphia to Los Angeles and all points in between, are under investigation for fabricating evidence, torturing prisoners to obtain confessions, and numerous other violations of fundamental rights, primarily in drug cases, and primarily, though by no means exclusively directed against minorities. In Los Angeles County, no white person has been prosecuted through the federal courts on crack cocaine offenses in recent years. The state courts, through which their cases are channeled, average 8 years less in sentencing for the same offense than the feds who concentrate on blacks and Latinos. I told you in my book that these people are considered to be useless eaters and are targeted anyway. Nationally, the first-time possession of powder cocaine, an expensive form of the drug favored by white lawyers and yuppies, is treated 100 times as leniently as first-time possession of the same amount of the crack form, which is cheap and favored by poorer, darker inner-city residents. The so-called zero-tolerance game has also been used to accustom the average citizen to intrusive urine tests, radar surveillance of neighborhoods, random stop and searches of automobiles or persons, and other tools of the totalitarian corporate socialist state. Nazi means German National Socialist Workers' Party. The Nazis were socialists. Socialists are Nazis. Drug hysteria among officialdom, whether genuine or manufactured to serve the agency and agenda of oligarchy, is so pronounced, ladies and gentlemen, that bills are introduced to deny tax-exempt status to any organization that proposes the legalization of drugs, which is a position taken by such radicals as pundit William F. Buckley, former Secretary of State George Shultz, and Baltimore Mayor Kurt Schmoke. Now, folks, if war is the logical extension of diplomacy, organized crime is the logical extension of business. It is sharp practice turned murderous, tax avoidance made systematic, competition followed to its logical conclusion. And that is a direct statement, a direct quote from a 1980 Forbes Business magazine article. In case you think I'm being unfair to business, it was business who said this. During a brief lull in its habitual somnolence throughout the Reagan area, one of the sleepy lapdogs of this fourth estate had the temerity to object to National Security Advisor John Poindexter's memorandum, in which he had outlined and subsequently carried out a program of disinformation aimed at the domestic media in order to build a consensus for an attack on Libya. In response, he blandly quoted Churchill to the effect that the truth was so precious that it had to be protected by a bodyguard of lies. Can you imagine such arrogance? Part of the reason, ladies and gentlemen, for prohibiting discussion of alternatives such as legalization is that the proponents of tough love and tougher sentences frequently have no honest argument to make whatsoever, so that in a genuine debate they would be almost certain to lose. You see, nobody seemed to have learned anything from Prohibition. What happened? Well, you had some people getting drunk. And yeah, they ruined their careers. And yeah, they weren't able to make any money and feed their families. So what happened? You outlaw booze, and these same people and many more. You see, when you deal with morals, ladies and gentlemen, on a level such as this, you're dealing with what's called vice. That is that little creature in all of us that is sometimes portrayed as sitting on our shoulders, whispering in our ear, telling us to do something that we know we should not do, or to take the easy way, or the way that feels good, or to escape from reality by inebriating ourselves with alcohol and drugs. And we all have our vices. I don't care who you are. Don't ever get in my face and tell me that you have not at some time or other during your life been a human being. Because I will call you a liar just as quick to your face. You cannot legislate these things away, ladies and gentlemen. What happened when Prohibition was implemented was that more people sought out alcohol and places to drink alcohol. And many people who never had anything to do with alcohol began to manufacture alcohol in their bathtubs because they could make a quick profit from it. It created a huge organized crime network that we have not rid ourselves of to this very day, that did not exist before Prohibition was created. And the drug war is doing exactly the same thing. What happened when Prohibition was done away with? The drinking of alcohol went down, ladies and gentlemen. Organized crime lost its biggest source of revenue. Speakeasies and honky-tonk joints all over the place went out of business. And it never stopped anybody who wanted a drink from getting a drink, just like the war on drugs today has never stopped anybody and never will stop anybody who wants to get high on drugs from doing so. And you can sputter and bluster and argue and say whatever you want. What I just told you is the truth. And that's what you had better learn to deal with. In 1989, Parents for a Drug-Free America was forced to acknowledge that it had been using footage of the brainwaves of a person in a coma to represent those of a person under the influence of marijuana. A lapse that they indicated they felt perfectly justified in undertaking, though they refrained from following Poindexter's example in quoting Churchill. During the campaign to reinstitute Prohibition in Alaska, A DEA officer claimed at a meeting in Anchorage that no one ever died from tobacco use. Other troopers in the bodyguard that surfaced during that extended campaign were the old gateway drug argument. The claim that marijuana grown then was more than 10 times as powerful as that grown 15 years earlier, and the insinuation of permanent sterility from casual use, all lies. And remember, I don't advocate drug use. Don't use drugs. Don't advise anybody to use drugs. But I'm not stupid enough to think that I'm going to stop them from doing it if they really want to. Because if the largest police state ever created in the history of the world, that has imprisoned more people in the history of the world than any other country in the history of the world per capita, can't stop them, who am I to think that I can do it? And who the hell are you to think that you're going to do it? After 24 years, you haven't done it, and in the next 24 years, you're not going to do it either. Every major episode of drug hysteria in this country, ladies and gentlemen, has been manufactured through the adroit use of lies and propaganda, combined with appeals to fear and racism to divide the nation, to create a crime wave that should never have existed for crimes that are not crimes at all, in order to enslave a certain segment of the population, in order to manipulate them so that another segment of the population will consent to give up their rights endowed by their Creator upon birth and protected by their Constitution, so that they can bring about the utopian socialist world, utopian BS lie. Many of you go along with it. Most people don't really think at all. They follow the lead of others who have done the thinking for them and are manipulating them and deceiving them into the world that they want, not the world that we want or that you want. You don't even know where you're going. At the turn of the century, folks, lurid stories of opium fiends and dens of iniquity, illustrated with drawings of slimy Orientals helping disrobe an innocent-looking Caucasian woman, helped lead to the passage of the first United States anti-drug legislation, which was the Harrison Act in 1914. The headlines of the time linked cocaine usage with race riots, while New York police blamed no less than 60% of all violent crime on the use of the drug and proposed deporters users to addict farms, and then these very same police officers, mayors, city councilmen, legislators, governors, and distinguished citizens sat around the drugstore counter drinking their dosage of cocaine in their bottle of Coca-Cola. What hypocrisy, what stupidity, what apathy and ignorance has brought us to this point, ladies and gentlemen. God gave us a brain. And like Rush Limbaugh, most of us choose to sit on it, or tie it behind our back, or whatever it is that he does with half his brain. I am alternately driven to hilarious laughter or profuse tears over this. Does it sound familiar? I was talking about the turn of the century, ladies and gentlemen. Doesn't it sound familiar? Of course it does. Also familiar was the strategy adopted to combat dangerous drugs. Blame foreigners. While Americans were consuming 10 times more drugs than the residents of any other country, authorities blamed supplier nations such as England and Japan, threatening to send the fleet to cut off the source of supply. Do you know that during World War II, the United States government paid farmers to grow marijuana? It was the biggest crop in the nation. All of the rope and line on Navy ships was made from hemp, marijuana. Many of the uniforms and pieces of equipment were made of woven hemp fibers. Most of you did not know that either, did you? Amazing, isn't it? Just absolutely amazing. You know that in many parts of America, huge, vast amounts of marijuana grows wild? Because during the war, that's where they had the marijuana crops. And they just can't get rid of the seeds. They just keep falling out and growing again. Now, who do we blame? Colombian drug lords. Are you kidding me? You guys really buying this story? These guys down in South America with a high school education, these guys are growing all these drugs, processing them, manufacturing the end product. They're transporting it all to the United States of America, and they have this brilliant, genius, logistic supply line that takes these drugs to every city, country, and village in America, and they're able to provide protection for this supply line and all of their people. And they're getting all of these billions upon billions upon billions upon billions of dollars. Are you nuts or what? How stupid can you be to believe that silly story? There's not even, folks, if you were to take all of the people and all of the industry in Colombia, you wouldn't account for 1% of the money that's produced through the manufacture, the growth, and the sale of drugs. There's nobody in Colombia who even begins to even distinguish themselves with even a minor portion of that kind of money. Why do you so eagerly? Like if you really, it's like you're waiting for them to tell you these stupid stories just so that you can believe them. Or have we just sunk into the depths and degradation of insanity? Oh, it's the Colombian drug kingpins that are doing all this stuff. Yep. Well, if it was them, why do we go down there and kill thousands of people in Panama to bring Manuel Noriega back to this country and put him in jail? Ostensibly for drugs. Folks, what we did, folks, to Noriega had absolutely nothing to do with drugs. I can't tell you exactly why that happened, but it wasn't about drugs at all. He obviously did something that made Bush real mad. That's for sure. And by the way, I predicted the invasion of Panama just 3 days before it happened. Told the world on a broadcast of the Alan Handelman show when I was a guest that within 2 weeks we would invade Panama. 3 days later, we did. I'm not going to tell you how I knew, because anybody who had any brains and had ears and was listening could have made the same prediction. The corruption, ladies and gentlemen, of present-day law enforcement had its counterpart as well You see, investigations of the dope ring led by Arnold Rothstein just before the onset of the Great Depression revealed that the head of the U.S. Drug Police, established barely half a decade before, had been on Rothstein's payroll as a lawyer. Makes me just want to go get drunk. I can't believe this situation that we're in simply because we choose to be in this situation, because we have turned off the switch that activates our thinking process, and we refuse to use it. Just refuse for some reason. In the 1930s, newly appointed head of the newly reorganized Federal Bureau of Narcotics, whose name was Harry Anslinger, campaigned vigorously for harsher laws to combat the, quote, new menace, end quote, of marijuana use. This was in the 30s. The government paid farmers to raise marijuana during World War II. But this guy was targeting especially the role of jazz musicians, you can interpret that as blacks, and mules from Mexico, which means wetbacks. And the Sunday Oregonian cooperated by denouncing, quote, the great American brain killer dance music, end quote. This was in the 30s. Can you imagine? You know, I play music from the 30s all the time, and everybody says, oh, that's old stuff. It's not, you know, some people appreciate it, like me. Brain killer music, they called it. While much of the media, when not recirculating fanciful stories about muggles, orgies leading to death, waxed by turns sentimentally protective, dragging the children down with dope, and sternly censorious Hollywood actress nabbed with dope, her film career now closed by death stories. All total BS, lies, crap, crapola. Pablum for babies who don't know how to think yet. The hysteria, ladies and gentlemen, drummed up by Anslinger succeeded in thwarting the movement to repeal the Harrison Act on the grounds that it was doing more harm than good, and led instead to the passage of the Marijuana Tax Act, which placed a prohibitive tax on the possession of hemp, and thus succeeded in outlawing constitutionally protected private behavior while being promoted ostensibly as a revenue enhancer. And to this day, ladies and gentlemen, so you think that drugs are illegal, and you think that you cannot legally possess marijuana? I'm telling you that that's not true. You can possess any amount of marijuana that you want to possess if you're willing to pay the tax to do it. Just like David Koresh could have owned as many machine guns as he wanted to own as long as he paid the $200 tax on each one of them. The truth is, he didn't even own one. Not one machine gun did David Koresh or any of his people own. You see, most of you don't know that the government just lies their head off. If you believe for one moment that what happened in Waco, Texas was about a machine gun, then you're about as far from reality as you can possibly be. Do you really think all of that happened and they spent millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars to kill all those people and then burn their church to the ground because they didn't pay a $200 tax? When in the world will you wake up, ladies and gentlemen? It's beyond me. Hemp, folks, not so incidentally, was poised at that time to revolutionize the paper and textile industries as a cheap decorticator had recently been introduced, allowing the highly pulpy plant to be fully utilized for the first time. You see, the timber subsidiaries of the Hearst newspaper chain, which led the outcry against what Hearst first popularized as marijuana, would have lost a great deal of money if hemp would have been used to replace wood for paper. And you wouldn't have this big environmental thing and people driving steel spikes into trees and the lumber business dying. It would have just shifted over to the growing of hemp. You see, this was all a manipulation by powerful men with lots of money who had vested interest in producing wood pulp for paper. Meanwhile, the DuPont Corporation, folks, had just patented a highly polluting sulfuric acid process for wood pulp paper. And they had just told its stockholders that this process would account for 80% of its pulp shipments over the next 50 years. DuPont's chief financial backer was President Hoover's Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon of the Mellon Bank. In his role as secretary, he was responsible for the appointment of Anslinger, who later married his niece. Thus, the threat of competition was removed through the power of the state, at the same time as a further tool of repression was added to the arsenal of the control lobby. Don't you feel just a little bit foolish? Same thing is happening today, folks. Even as the last veneer of constitutional protection of individual rights is stripped away, and the provisions of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations as a treaty, which they say is legally binding on every agent of the government in the United States, become a dead letter, all purportedly in order to stop the use of certain officially disapproved psychoactive substances. The marketing of other such substances, far more deadly, proceeds apace, not only under the benevolent eye of Big Brother, but with subsidies provided courtesy of Mr. and Mrs. John Q. Citizen. Can anybody tell me why it's legal for anybody to go buy a bottle of booze and get blasted out of their mind anytime they want to? Or they can smoke cigarettes, cigarette after cigarette after cigarette after pack after pack after pack after pack after pack if they want to, which causes more problems, more deaths, more murders, more beatings, more thefts than drugs ever could. I find it just absolutely unbelievable. Good night, ladies and gentlemen, and God bless each and every single one of you. And I sincerely mean that. And God save this great republic.
All of a sudden, in the middle of the night, there's a loud knock on your door. Hey, honey, something's not right.
Throw out your arms. Let the scuffle pass through. We're here from the government. We're here to help you.
And I'm from the IRS with a power to tax. If you've got a complaint, pay us a tax.
Get out of this house. Serve your taxes. Give me your gold. You can obey if you want to go home. That's the good stuff and do what you're told.
Hillary Shalala, Reno Janet Dyke, reading the words of General Albert Pike, demonic founder of the Ku Klux Klan, engineer of the Masonic Master Plan. Pike said Lucifer is God across this land, and Clinton saying hit the mark in your right hand. While we're all dancing to the drums of a Fourth Reich, Clinton's preparing it for another huge tax hike. Order out of chaos, depression, inflation, creates a panic and rape the nation. Crisis creation. Incite black and white. Program agitation.
Don't resist! You're surrounded! By the UN in white and blue, the ATF, the men in black, and the one world order.
But it's not new. Iron Mountain, computer beasts, and cattle mutilations. Black projects, UFOs, and weird genetic combinations. The Nazi doctors didn't die? Come on, get him. They came here with the OSS through Operation Paperclip. National ID, debit card? Yeah. Vaccination biochip, milk carton kids, genetic engineering. Clinton says her health plans for you and your own good. Sure. And Adolf Hitler's Robin Hood. The sonic mind manipulation, inciting riots is crisis creation. Biochip implantation. Vaccinate your kid for UN identification.
This is a test for all of us. So I have today just one simple request. A comprehensive package of healthcare benefits that are always there and can never be taken away.
Atmospheric sociallusion. Media hype. Plan confusion. Masonic religion. It's a liar. Got you praying for a Luciferian Messiah.
This is